My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 43 years old, and 11 months ago, I stood on a small stage in a $5,000 dress while my husband auctioned me off to a room full of strangers like I was a weekend at his lake house. I want to tell you exactly how that happened, why I let it happen, and what occurred in the 90 seconds after the winning bid that ended my marriage and began the most satisfying revenge of my life. But to understand that night, you need to understand the 18 years that came before it. I married Richard Whitfield when I was 25. He was 31, ambitious, charming in that polished, country club way that either draws you in completely or repels you instantly. I fell hard. He ran a mid-sized investment firm his father had built, and I gave up a promising career in event planning to help him grow it, first as his unofficial marketing director, then as the woman who organized every gala, every donor dinner, every ribbon cutting that made Whitfield Capital look like a pillar of the community. I was good at it. I was, if I'm honest, the reason half of Richard's biggest clients ever walked through his door. He knew the numbers. I knew the people. For the first decade, it worked. We had 2 children, a son named Mason and a daughter named Everly, a house in the kind of neighborhood where the hedges are trimmed by professionals, and a life that looked, from the outside, like something out of a magazine. Richard was not an easy man to love. He counted things. He counted how much I spent on groceries, how much attention I gave the kids versus how much I gave him, how many times I'd said no to him in a given month. But I told myself that was just who he was. Controlled. Disciplined. A man who built an empire out of spreadsheets doesn't leave his personality at the office. The cracks started showing around year 14. Small things at first, a business trip that ran 2 days longer than it needed to, a phone that started living face down on the nightstand, a new cologne I didn't recognize. I want to be honest with you, I saw all of it. I chose not to look directly at it, the way you don't look directly at the sun even though you know it's there, burning a hole in the sky. I had 2 kids in middle school, a mortgage tied to his income, and a mother with early-stage dementia whose care I was quietly funding. Leaving wasn't a door I let myself open. By year 17, Richard had changed in ways I couldn't unsee anymore. He'd started making jokes about me in front of other people, little digs disguised as affection. "Claire keeps me humble," he'd say at dinner parties, and everyone would laugh, and I would laugh too, because what else do you do? He started introducing me not as his wife, but as the woman who makes sure I look good, which sounds like a compliment until you hear it enough times to understand it isn't one. And then came the Whitfield Family Foundation Gala. It was Richard's crown jewel event, an annual black tie fundraiser for children's hospitals that had grown, over the years, into the social event of our city's autumn calendar. For 100 guests. A silent auction. A live auction. Local news coverage. I had built that event from a card table bake sale into a 6-figure fundraiser over 12 years, and every single year, I ran it from behind the scenes while Richard shook hands under the chandelier and took the credit at the podium. That year, he told me he had a surprise for the live auction. A special lot. He wouldn't tell me what it was, just that it would bring the house down and raise more money than anything we'd ever auctioned before, more than the week at the Amalfi Coast Villa, more than the private jet weekend, more than the round of golf with a retired NFL quarterback. I should have known something was wrong the way he smiled when he said it. It wasn't excitement. It was the smile of a man enjoying a joke that only he was in on. The gala went beautifully at first. I wore a midnight blue gown I'd had tailored for the occasion, my hair pinned the way Richard liked it, diamond earrings that had been his mother's. I greeted donors, thanked our biggest sponsors by name, made sure the string quartet started on time. I was, as I had been for over a decade, the invisible architecture holding the whole evening up. Then Richard took the stage for the live auction, and he called my name. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, that same private joke smile spreading across his face, "for our final lot tonight, we have something truly one of a kind. A weekend getaway with my beautiful wife, Claire, dinner, dancing, whatever the lucky winner desires. All proceeds, of course, to the children's wing." The room laughed. Some of them looked at me with sympathy, assuming this was a cute, harmless bit between a husband and wife who clearly adored each other. A few of the wives near the front actually clapped. I stood frozen near the edge of the stage, my stomach dropping through the floor, because I understood something none of them did. Richard had never asked me. Not once. Not a whisper of a warning. He had decided, unilaterally, to put me, his wife of 18 years, up for auction in front of 400 people, and he had done it with a grin, like he was gifting the room a party favor. I want to be clear about something, because I know how this sounds from the outside. This wasn't playful. This wasn't a couple in on a bit together. I felt the blood leave my face. I felt every eye in that ballroom shift to me, waiting to see how I'd react, and I understood in that instant that Richard had turned me into entertainment without my consent, in front of every person whose respect I had spent a decade earning. He held his hand out toward me like he was presenting a piece of furniture. "Come on up here, Claire, don't be shy." I could have said no. I think about that a lot. What would have happened if I'd simply turned around and walked out of that ballroom in my blue dress and never looked back? But 18 years of training yourself to keep the peace, to protect the image, to not make a scene in front of Richard's clients, doesn't undo itself in 10 seconds. So I walked up onto that small stage with my heart hammering and a smile frozen onto my face like a mask, and I let my husband auction me off. The bidding started low, a joke bid of $500 from one of Richard's golfing buddies, which got another laugh from the room. Then it climbed. 1,000. 2,000. One of our longtime donors, a widower named Harold who I'd always found sweet and harmless, bid 3,000 with a wink in my direction that made my skin crawl. I stood there smiling that frozen smile while grown men bid on an evening of my company like I was a case of wine, and Richard stood beside me beaming, clearly thrilled with how much money he was pulling in, utterly blind or utterly indifferent to the fact that his wife was dying inside in real time. The bidding had crawled up to $6,000 and seemed to be stalling when a voice from the back of the ballroom, calm and unhurried, cut through the room. $50,000. The entire ballroom went silent. I couldn't see who had spoken at first. The spotlight on the stage made the back tables a wall of shadow. Richard's smile faltered for just a second, a flicker I doubt anyone else caught, before he recovered it and laughed into the microphone. "Well, someone's feeling generous tonight. 50,000, going once." "I'm not bidding on a weekend," the voice said, and now a man was walking forward, out of the shadows and into the light, and I realized with a jolt that I recognized him. "I'm bidding on the truth. $50,000, and in exchange, everyone in this room gets to hear what Richard Whitfield has actually been doing for the last 2 years. I want you to understand who this man was, because it matters enormously to what happened next." His name was Daniel Osei. 15 years earlier, Daniel had been a junior associate at Whitfield Capital, bright, meticulous, and, as I would later learn, the one person at that firm who had actually noticed the irregularities in Richard's books long before anyone else did. Richard had fired him abruptly, blacklisted him from 2 other firms in the city through a few well-placed phone calls, and moved on without a second thought, the same way he moved on from anything that threatened his image. What Richard didn't know, what none of us knew, until that night, was that Daniel had spent the last year working as a forensic consultant for a client who had grown suspicious of Whitfield Capital's returns. And in the course of that work, Daniel hadn't just uncovered financial irregularities. He had uncovered something far more personal. He had proof that for the past 2 years, Richard had been funneling money, not company money, our money, from accounts I had spent 2 decades helping build, into a second household. An apartment downtown. A woman named Vanessa, 29 years old, who worked in Richard's marketing department, hired 18 months after I had stepped back from that role to care for my mother. A woman who, as it turned out, was 7 months pregnant. Daniel stood in the middle of that ballroom, $50,000 richer in credibility than anyone in the room, and he laid it out calmly, methodically, the way you'd present a closing argument you'd been rehearsing for years. Bank statements. Lease agreements. A paper trail. Richard, in his arrogance, had never bothered to hide well because he never imagined anyone would look, least of all a fired associate he'd forgotten existed, and least of all his own wife, whom he had spent 18 years training not to ask questions. I stood on that stage in my midnight blue dress, in front of 400 people, and I watched my husband's face drain of all its color as the life he had built on top of me collapsed in real time. Richard tried to laugh it off first. "This is ridiculous, get security." But Daniel simply held up a folder and asked whether Richard would like him to read the apartment lease out loud instead, the one with Richard's signature on it, dated 14 months earlier. The room, which moments ago had been laughing along with a joke about auctioning off a wife, had gone completely, deathly silent. Every donor, every client, every friend we had cultivated over 18 years of curated dinner parties was staring at Richard Whitfield like they were seeing him for the first time. And here is the part one still think about most. In that silence, I didn't feel destroyed. I felt something crack open in my chest that I can only describe as relief. Not because I wanted my marriage to end this way, in front of an audience, but because for 2 years I had felt something was wrong and had let Richard convince me I was imagining it, that I was paranoid, that I was ungrateful for the life he provided. Watching Daniel Osei lay the truth on the table in front of everyone was the first time in 2 years I felt like I wasn't losing my mind. Richard's lawyer, who happened to be a guest that evening, because of course he was, tried to intervene, threatening Daniel with a defamation suit on the spot. Daniel didn't even blink. He said, calmly, that everything he'd said was documented, verifiable, and that he'd be delighted to see Richard in court, where discovery would make the contents of that folder a matter of public record instead of a private humiliation. That shut the lawyer up fast. I remember Vanessa's name landing in that room like a stone dropped into still water. I remember hearing gasps from women I'd known for a decade, women who had eaten at my table, whose children had played with mine. I remember Harold, the sweet widower who'd bid $3,000 on an evening with me an hour earlier, quietly setting down his champagne glass like he didn't want to be holding anything in his hands anymore. I turned to Richard on that stage. I didn't yell. I didn't cry, not yet. That came later, in the car alone, where 18 years of swallowed anger finally found an exit. I looked at him and I asked one question into the microphone that was still, absurdly, clipped to my dress. "How long, Richard?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence answered for him, and 400 people watched him fail to answer his own wife in front of the charity he'd built his entire public identity around. I walked off that stage alone. Nobody stopped me. I didn't look back at the $50,000 bid, at the shattered fundraiser, at the husband whose empire had just collapsed in real time in front of the very people he'd spent his life impressing. I got in my car, drove home, and for the first time in 2 years, I slept without the low hum of anxiety I'd been carrying in my chest like a second heartbeat. The weeks that followed were, in a strange way, the beginning of the best year of my adult life, even though they started as the worst. Richard tried, at first, to salvage the narrative, tried to paint the whole thing as a smear campaign orchestrated by a bitter former employee. But paper trails don't care about narratives. Daniel's documentation was airtight because Daniel had spent an entire career being the kind of meticulous, careful person Richard had once fired for being inconvenient. Within a month, 2 of Whitfield Capital's largest institutional clients had pulled their accounts, citing concerns about leadership integrity. Within 3 months, the firm's name had become a punchline in local business circles instead of a symbol of prestige. I hired my own attorney, not Richard's golf buddy, not anyone connected to his circle, but a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Nair who specialized in high-asset divorces and who looked at the financial records Daniel had handed over and said, with something close to delight in her voice, "Claire, he made this easy for us." Because it turned out that money funneled to a second household during an intact marriage doesn't just look bad at a gala. It looks very, very bad in front of a judge dividing marital assets, especially when it can be shown that those funds came directly from accounts I had spent 2 decades building alongside him. I want to pause here and say something plainly, because I think it's the whole point of this story. Revenge, when it's done right, isn't about screaming matches or slashed tires or petty cruelty. Real revenge is patience wearing a calm face. It's showing up to every mediation meeting prepared, informed, and completely unshaken, while the man who once counted your grocery receipts watches you take apart the empire he built on your labor, piece by piece, with nothing but documents and a steady voice. The divorce settlement, when it finally came through 8 months later, was not what Richard's lawyer had promised him going in. I walked away with the house, a substantial portion of the firm's assets given the direct link between marital funds and the affair, and full custody arrangements that reflected who had actually been present for our children's lives for the past 2 decades. Mason, 17 by then, barely spoke to his father for months. Everly, 14, asked me once, very quietly, why Daddy had done that to me in front of everyone, and I told her the truth, that some people mistake the people who love them for furniture until someone else shows them otherwise. As for Daniel Osei, I'll admit, people have asked me over the past year whether there was something romantic behind his $50,000 bid, whether this was some slow-burn love story dressed up as justice. It wasn't, not at first, and I want to be honest rather than tie this up in a neat bow that isn't true. What Daniel did that night wasn't about me specifically. It was about a debt he felt he owed to the truth, to the people Richard had steamrolled on his way up, and yes, if I'm honest, to his own satisfaction at finally, after 15 years, watching the man who'd tried to erase him have to answer for something in public. We stayed in touch after the gala, mostly through the divorce proceedings, since his documentation became central to my case. Somewhere in those months of coffee meetings that started as fact-checking sessions, something changed. I won't pretend it was instant. Trust doesn't rebuild itself in a season. But a year later, there's a version of my life now that includes a man who looked at injustice and decided, quietly and without fanfare, to do something about it instead of walking past it, and that is a quality I had gone 18 years without in a marriage, and one I have no intention of taking for granted again. I started my own event planning firm 6 months after the divorce was finalized, the career I'd set aside at 26 to build Richard's image instead of my own. It turns out that 12 years of running a nonprofit gala from the shadows, while someone else took the podium, teaches you exactly how to build something that carries your name instead of someone else's. My first major client was, fittingly, the very same Children's Hospital Foundation Richard had used me to build. The board reached out to me directly. They didn't want him running their gala anymore. They wanted me. Richard, last I heard, sold his stake in Whitfield Capital to a competitor at a fraction of its former value, moved to a smaller city 2 states away, and is, according to mutual friends, still trying to explain to new acquaintances why his name triggers a strange, uncomfortable silence whenever it comes up in certain circles back home. Vanessa left him 4 months after their daughter was born. I understand the appeal of a man who buys you an apartment fades quickly once you learn exactly what kind of man does that. People sometimes ask me if I regret walking onto that stage that night instead of refusing outright. I don't, not anymore. Because if Richard had simply asked me privately to help boost that year's fundraising total, I would have said no, and the truth might have stayed buried for years while he continued building a second life on the foundation of my labor and my silence. Instead, his arrogance, his absolute certainty that I would never push back, that no one in that room would ever question him, that the world would keep bending to accommodate his comfort, became the very thing that exposed him. Sometimes the people who are most confident they'll never get caught are the ones standing directly under the spotlight when the truth finally walks up out of the dark and calls their bluff. I think about that ballroom often. The chandelier light. The frozen smile I wore while men bid on an evening of my company like I was a line item in a budget. And then the silence, the absolute, ringing silence, after Daniel said $50,000 and the truth started spilling out into a room that had spent 18 years only ever seeing the version of us Richard wanted them to see. That silence was the sound of my old life ending. And underneath it, so quiet I almost didn't notice it at first, was the sound of a new one beginning. I built that new one myself. And this time, nobody's name is on it but mine.